So let me just do a quick introduction of this amazing panel we have today. I'm sorry, I'm going to do them a little out of order. So Jim Lewis, is currently focusing on conflict, emerging technology, and international security at the Center for European Policy Analysis. His writing and research focuses on how innovation changes global competition, technology reshapes society, and state power. Jim previously served as a U.S. diplomat and a member of the Senior Executive Service with it spanned national security, technology, transfer and export control, encryption, internet security, and international negotiations. Hey, your bio's long, man. He has also been an advisor with a multilateral setting, serving as a senior advisor, multiple UN groups of government experts on information security, which are all central to the evolution of international cyber norms and status and frameworks that we're working with today. Jim has been a senior advisor and a leader at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he directed the major programs, commissions, and produced foundation work on cybersecurity strategy, technology, competition, national power, and he is affiliated with the U.S. Naval Academy cybersecurity community as a visiting professor and reflects on ongoing roles translating strategic issues into operational defense audiences. So you all should be very impressed that you're at the right place. Forget what those other groups are talking about. Rob Knake is the CEO of TPO Group. He is a cybersecurity strategist that focuses on government and company organized budget and government cybersecurity risks. He currently leads the TPO Group, advising organizations on cybersecurity strategy and governance. He served as the first deputy national cyber director of the Office of National Cybersecurity at the White House, where he helped stand up the organization and led the work tied to national cyber strategy and federal cyber budget priorities, which we all know we're going to get into that in a bit. We've been having some issues with our cyber budget. Earlier, he served as the director of cybersecurity policy at the National Security Council, responsible for developing presidential cyber policy and federal processes, incident response, and vulnerability management. In addition to running CPO Group, he serves as a venture partner and strategic advisor in the investment and advisory ecosystem, including Paladin Capital Group, and has advised multiple cybersecurity firms in his advisory capacity. Camille, who's sitting right next to me. Camille Stewart Gloster is a strategist, an attorney, and an executive whose career bridges cybersecurity, emerging technology, national security, and technology governance. She is the founder and CEO of, do you call it CAS or CAS?
I hear it both ways.
Which do you prefer?
CAS.
Okay, CAS. All right. From now on, CAS Strategies, advising on cyber and emerging technology, resilience, and policy. She served as the first deputy national cyber director for technology and ecosystem security at the White House, advising on technology security, supply chain integrity, emerging technologies, and cyber workforce development. Her portfolio often is described as spanning technology to ecosystem and operational national initiatives, connecting policy design and implementing across government industries. In addition to her government leadership, she held senior roles at Google, including product and security strategy and security policy, and has been affiliated with major professional service organizations. Michael Daniels, who I've now had the luck to be with 2 weeks in a row for several things, President and CEO of Cyber Threat Alliance, CTA. Michael leads the Cyber Threat Alliance, a nonprofit membership organization focused on improving cybersecurity outcomes through trusted, actionable threat information sharing among other security vendors and partners. Daniel served as special assistant to the President Obama's cybersecurity coordinator on National Security Council in 2012 to 2017. In that role, he led the development of national cybersecurity strategy and policy and coordinated partnerships across agencies, the private sector, and international counterparts. Prior to the NSC role, Daniel spent 17 years as the Office of Management and Budget, including Chief Intelligence Branch and career senior executive service positions, overseeing intelligence and other classified national security programs, experiences that strongly shaped his latter focus on making cyber policy operational and budget real. Since 2017, Daniel has been the nonprofit sector coordinator at the CTA, building mechanisms for scaling collaboration and rapid intelligence sharing across companies to improve collective defense. So if you're wondering if you're in a room full of smart people, that has answered your question. So I'm actually just going to start with this whole process and Commissioner Gomez was just talking about things that's going on in the government. There's an issue that's going on cyber that has gotten the attention of Congress for a couple different reasons. So I'm going to start with the CISA versus CISA challenge. And we're going to just, first of all, have you guys help define this, because part of the challenge with this CISA versus CISA is that most people don't know that it's going on. People in Congress who sit on the committees understand it, Some people in leadership understand it. People at the Department of Homeland Security who are trying to do their jobs at the government cybersecurity agency definitely understand it. But I'm just going to kind of go down the road here and see if we can get a couple comments on what's going on and how do we best fix this challenge of the lack of understanding between the name of a piece of legislation and the importance of CISA, the agency at the Department of Homeland Security, because we desperately need to fix this problem. So I'll start with you.
First, thank you all for joining us. This is such a great group. We have long had a narrative problem in cybersecurity, and it is a big part of why it causes a lot of confusion and consternation amongst folks that are trying to understand what is going on around them. This CISA versus CISA issue is a microcosm of a much larger problem. That said, we have to be a lot more specific in how we're talking about it to kind of bifurcate the issues. I actually think that the conflation of the two is intentional by some folks, right? Blend it all together so that it justifies the stalemate that we find ourselves in a number of fronts across both the agency and the legislation. And so having a more nuanced conversation about what each brings, what they benefit, who will feel the impacts of the rollbacks that we're seeing is one of the best ways for us to make some progress.
Jim, can you help us define the problem here? What is the difference of CISA versus CISA? You've done this for me before, so if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. So one is a piece of legislation that enables information sharing in a protected way. The other is an agency that is radioactive. And part of the reason they're radioactive is because they broadened their remit beyond what the Congress and certainly this administration had in mind to look at truth in advertising and to remember not CISA, and CISA gets tagged with this, which is unfortunate, but DHS created, I forget what it was called, like the Office of Official Truth or something. And that wasn't real popular, and it's come back to haunt them. So part of what we've got going on is the old ways we define truth in a public space don't work anymore. You know, this is kind of the Section 230 debate which slops into it, but CISA is held accountable, wrongly, I'd say, by this administration for the fact that we had an effort to eliminate hate speech, misinformation, disinformation. I didn't think it was necessary. You can argue with that, but that was sort of where things started to go off the rails, is we will identify disinformation. And as I say, CISA, part of it is the Chris Krebs effect. Chris was the first CISA director. He astutely arranged to have himself fired by Donald Trump, which is the best way to work for the Trump administration. But ever since then, this is a president who holds grudges. And so CISA's in his crosshairs. The fact that people are confused is a little embarrassing, but not a complete surprise.
Michael, is there a solution set to this other than just changing the name of the legislation so it isn't called CISA? Is that our best way forward?
So I've actually been on record as recommending changing the name of the acronym just to avoid the confusion. I mean, it seems really stupid, but that's oftentimes how it works in Washington, to just change the acronym. I would say that there's a couple of things. One is the agency itself, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The prime sin that it committed was saying that the 2020 election was secure. That's the primary sin that it committed. And it was. That election was secure, as was the 2024 election. Both of them actually fairly reflected the votes that were cast. Now, you could talk about whether or not social media influence, people influence operations, all of that. But if you actually talk about the votes that were cast, and they were properly counted and reflected the outcomes of the votes that were cast, both of those elections were secure. And so the fact that this administration takes umbrage with that, I think, is a real problem. The Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 should be the subject of some really interesting poli-sci, masters and dissertations, because you have a piece of legislation that Democrats think is good, most Republicans think is good, industry supports, the privacy groups don't really oppose, and yet we can't get it through Congress. All we can do is get it extended just barely to the end of this year. So you have to ask yourself, what is wrong in the system that we can't actually get a piece of legislation that has that much broad support across the finish line? And again, there's a misunderstanding about what that piece of legislation actually enables. And mostly that piece of legislation deals with kicking lawyers out of the room. I mean, that's mostly what it does.
It's a bipartisan goal.
Yes, absolutely. And what I mean by that is it actually provides a structure around information sharing in the cybersecurity space to say that if you are sharing this kind of information in this kind of context, you can rest assured that it is in fact legal to do so. That's what it does. And so if we let it lapse, what you will see, and what we even saw during some of the periods when it did lapse, is the slow creep of reintroducing friction into the information sharing ecosystem. And friction is one of those things that we actually don't need to be reintroduced into the information sharing system.
Rob, your thoughts on that? Because I'm just going to rephrase when I talk about what Michael talks, I say it's the indemnification so important because there's a lot of things the engineers want to share that the lawyers won't let them. And the information sharing, if it's done at the right level and with that indemnification, brings us to a faster conclusion a lot of times of what we've either just seen or what we're trying to stop. So sorry, kind of a leading question there, but
Yeah, so let me add to Michael's litany of reasons that you shouldn't impose it. I think the scoring on it from a budget perspective is at or near zero. So it costs almost no money, yet it takes away this problem that has been well documented in the space for over a decade. So it makes sense to pass it. Now, how are we going to get over this impasse? That's what I've been trying to focus on. And renaming CISA the bill is definitely one good option. Another option is to rename CISA the organization and sort of hand that win to the Trump administration to say they got rid of CISA, rename it, recreate it, move it around the org chart within DHS, and then reinvest in it, get the budget back up, rehire people or hire new people and fulfill the mission. Because the biggest problem we have right now, in my view, is that CISA, the organization, has pretty much fallen apart over the last year. It was building capacity, it was building budget. It had grown to a size where it really was having an impact on the ecosystem. And many of the things that the organization was doing have now just fallen apart. So I am by nature an optimist. I think now that we've gone through the lowercase doging of CISA, there could be an opportunity if we say, yep, here's the new version of it, and it's something else. Somebody can make up an acronym. I'm not great at that.
NPPD.
Some people,
Please no.
Some people need an explanation. Find us in the hallway afterwards. But yeah, I think
we'll hold a
that may be
contest.
the answer.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So now I want to stay on the budget question because there's two parts to the budget question. One is the government spending, and then the other is commercial spending. And one of my hopes, now that everything is AI, you have to say AI for everything, is we might actually get a privacy bill out of this because there's going to be more of a need for data. And then the other one is that a lot of IT in the organization, they have all these legacy systems that are very kludgy that up until now didn't seem like a big problem if baby parts of it broke. But the advent of AI coming into these systems means we could see some like incredibly amazing forceful helix just smash an entire system that wasn't prepared for it. So do we finally have people's attention on cybersecurity by abstention through people looking through the lens of artificial intelligence? And are they finally going to get some money? And I guess I'm going to let you choose if you want to go commercial, government, or both. I'll just start here. Yeah.
So I work with companies on this every day. The ones that get it do. They recognize that security is performance. How you make sure your AI systems, and particularly your AI agents, stay inbound, do what you have said they are going to, don't amass unintended authority, don't exhibit emergent behavior without you being able to notice it and course correct it. All of those things are recognizing that they have to invest in security in a way that helps them enable the functionality, but also protect them and mitigate risk. Unfortunately, that is a small amount of organizations that realize it at a real tangible, let's put the money behind it level. And there are a number of small and medium organizations and even some large ones that really just want to move fast and don't quite understand how to strike that balance to be able to enable the functionality and the capability in a way that protects them from risk. Unfortunately, I think increasingly, we will start to see things that push them in a direction. For example, I had a client call me to say they were effectively DDoSing their customers because their agent was doing something, I won't get too specific, that was flooding their customers with notifications to a point where they were upset, but they could not stop it because stopping the agent meant cutting off critical capability. The more organizations experience things like that, that one is relatively contained, but it could be much bigger. They will realize that they have to invest in security. And there are a lot of organizations that are contending with this new role that they must play as government pushes down the responsibility of security to state government, and as they look to industry to drive what innovation looks like. They're coming together in these trade associations and consortia trying to think about these issues. So I think there's a contending with it that's happening at industry, but it's not happening fast enough.
Jim, and we can also include the international concerns of what's going on in this space.
Sure. So I look at it from a sort of slightly different perspective. I bumped into a former senior intelligence official at a conference about a month ago, and we realized we'd both come independently to the same conclusion, which is the Chinese own us, right? So it's like, it's good. It's nice that we're doing all this stuff, but it's not working. And so that was part of why I thought this would be an interesting panel, is whatever we're doing isn't working, right? Part two, cybersecurity has been squeezed out, at least in the public space, by artificial intelligence. In fact, I tell people now, if you're going to write something, make sure you have the letters AI, and it can't be like SAIL or whatever. It's a tool. And so I'm not, now the AI chat room it might change this a little bit. Yeah, so it's a little weird. But putting that aside, because we'll see how it plays out, it's a tool. And so the question is, who can use the tool better? And I think ultimately the companies will be driven in the direction that Camille was talking about, to use the tool better for defense, but they'll be behind our key opponents, Russia and China. It amazes me the Russians have any economy left to exploit with AI, but apparently they do.
Maybe they're being underfunded. I mean, they're being funded by someone else.
Gee, I wonder who it could be.
I don't know.
So we have to say AI now. I think the advantage lies with our opponents, but we can change that. That's the optimistic, happy ending. We can change that over a period of time. You know, how long that will be. Last time it took about 10 years. So maybe it'll be quicker this time.
Michael?
Yeah, I think when you look at how we've structured cybersecurity across the ecosystem at a macro level, what we've really done is we've pushed the cybersecurity burden all the way out to the edge, whatever that edge is. And if that edge happens to be JP Morgan Chase, then okay, you're fine. But if the edge happens to be my mother, that's not as good, right? And so the way that we've structured cybersecurity overall in the ecosystem doesn't work. That's part of our problem. And so we have to have a fundamental rethinking about how we actually structure cybersecurity. And this is not a technology argument. This is actually about the political and economic organization for how we do cybersecurity as a society. And so we've got to really think about what cybersecurity burden do we want individuals and small businesses to have to shoulder? The answer is some. You don't want it to be none, right? But you probably don't want it to be all. And so the idea that we're going to have a rural water system take on the Chinese intelligence services all by their lonesome is kind of ridiculous. It doesn't pass the laugh test. So how do you actually re-architect and reorganize our system to enable the security burden to be allocated more fairly? There's also other issues in the economic structure of how we do software and hardware. All of the market incentives are to get your product to market first. There is no prize for being second. There used to be a joke in grad school. The grad school grading was A or F. You either got an A or you got an F. There was nothing in between. And so we're in that state with getting things to market. And so that means security takes a back seat. And if you think about most other markets, it's amazing that software producers bear no liability for how their product actually functions. There's almost no other market, no other product out there in the world where that is true. And so we really have to think about, is that the structure that we want for this environment? And how do you do that fairly? How do you change that liability structure, for example, in a way that doesn't kill off innovation? Because you still want innovation, you still want adaptation, you still want progress. But all of these are the questions that I think we have to answer if we want to actually change the dynamics that Jim is talking about and enable people to actually operate in a secure ecosystem.
Let me riff on Michael yet again. For at least another 13 hours, the national cyber strategy that Camille and I and others in the Biden administration put out remains in effect. New cyber strategy is apparently going to drop overnight tonight. The critical question for me, the biggest question of all, well, maybe there are two. One is, what's it going to say about regulation broadly? But secondarily, what's it going to say about software liability? We made a big push in the last strategy to say, damn it, we need software liability. That cannot be strict liability, but it needs to say, if you do these things and you do them correctly, and there is still a vulnerability in your software that is exploited and causes harm, you should not be liable for it. On the other hand, if you do not do these things, you should be held liable. And so it was liability with a safe harbor was the notion. I think this was the absolute most critical thing we did in that strategy, even more so than breaking the taboo against saying we needed regulation broadly in cybersecurity. If that goes away, and if there's no mention of that, we're going to be in a world of hurt, because we know that this administration does not like the idea of, in quotes, regulating AI. We know that Silicon Valley came out very strongly for this administration, for the Trump campaign, over the issue of regulation of AI. And so have they found a happy medium on this where they can say, yes, but don't you think that you should be liable in some way for producing bad software in a world where anybody can now produce software? Literally anybody can make software. There is no longer any kind of barrier to entry. And so given that, given what AI has done, we've got to find a way where we say, okay, Anthropic, what should you be liable for when you enable somebody to produce software? What should you, JP Morgan, be liable for if you use Anthropic to make software? And we don't have any kind of model for that in existence today, but that is the most important thing we need to address.
Last week or the week before, they canceled some executive orders. One of them, which is the one I think Rob is talking about, which people struggled mightily to make it as light a burden as possible. And so all you have to do is attest that you're observing the NIST guidelines, which didn't strike me. The alternative was CMMC, which is take $1 million in 3 years and come back when you're fixed. And so I thought it was pretty cool. And so we'll have to come back to this question. I think Michael's point, the starting thing for this is the big 3 car makers, back when that was a thing, said that if they were forced to observe safety regulations like seatbelts, it would destroy the American car industry. That was 1962, 1963. They were wrong. And so I don't think that requiring people to attest that they've observed the NIST guidelines, especially with the safe harbor positions, was such a big deal. We'll have to come back to that. Otherwise, why are we keeping NIST around? Which is a question some may be asking.
But you brought up a very good question about whose responsibility is it going to be with software. As we're seeing AI start to build more of that software, and you guys did a great job with SBOM, that you found something that the software bill of materials that actually I'd start to see repeated internationally with no attestation to the United States. And I was like, strangely, that's winning. That's great. The people really just adopted it. Are we working or thinking about working on something that has that new AI layover, which is where are you going to put this in to the layer of responsibility if it's not there, or responsibilities as it current stands? It's kind of open question.
Yeah, I know CISA is working on SBOM for AI. So we'll see what that turns out to be and how it's enforced and how it's used. I think there's a lot of work going on in silos around how do you think about attesting to what's in the software that you created. But it's obviously all voluntary, all to the extent that you're interested in doing so, and has no bearing on all the vibe-coded things that we're talking about right now. There's no uniform application of that. I know that there's a AI security EO percolating too. Maybe that will have some nuggets of either the SBOM for AI or something else that might move forward the software liability question. But we're more likely to see it play out in the courts, where some harm has happened and they have to start to parse out who's liable for what. And honestly, that's probably not the way we want it to happen, because bad facts make bad law, which means if it's litigated in the courts, we're likely to see a precedent that is very tailored to that set of facts. And that'll be a really tough place for us to operate from and not actually achieve the desired goal, because everyone will be able to reason themselves out of that framework, most likely, until it hits some kind of critical mass. So I think we're at a precipice where we could see some progress with this EO, with the work that's going on, SBOMs for AI, but I don't know that it will be meaningfully moved forward.
Other thoughts?
Well, I also think that there's a couple of other bigger trends in this space, one of which is the continued technological decoupling between the West and China, for example, but then also the drive, for example, for the Europeans to decouple on their own from the US. And we can have debates about how likely that is, but you are likely to see continued pressure from those places. So, for example, if we don't take action here in the United States, we may find ourselves where we're being forced to play the follower, because not everybody will wait for us. And I would say that the geopolitics are making that even less likely. And it's making it more likely that others will move faster and more sharply than the US will.
So what's happening with our reporting requirements, or I guess they're not necessarily obligations, depends on what it is, around critical infrastructure? Because that seems to be a huge challenge too, is now we were kind of coming to a consensus on how we would talk and cooperate with each other around information sharing, and it feels like that's being broken.
I can start the rule. So the critical information, the CERCIA piece of legislation.
Always go to an acronym when you can't say the word.
Absolutely. The Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act.
Well done.
Yeah.
Nice.
I do speak Washington acronym,
Yeah.
That act passed a number of years ago, back in 2022. And yet we have been unable to actually get the implementing regulation out of DHS. And actually, this is one place where I feel like the Biden administration's CISA actually fell down in not getting that regulation out before the end of that administration, because now it has been delayed by this administration even further. We're hearing maybe May, but if it goes at the same rate as we're not moving enough.
See, talk about critical infrastructure.
Right.
Lights go
Exactly.
on.
There is movement in the room, just not enough.
Yes.
That's actually really funny.
But again, so there's really two things that actually that piece of legislation said that DHS actually has to define. The legislation essentially says if you're in critical infrastructure and you have a substantial cyber incident, you've got to report that to DHS, to CISA. So there's two things that actually have to be defined in order for that to go into effect. One, what qualifies as critical infrastructure? And two, what qualifies as a substantial cyber incident, right? Those are the two things you got to define. And actually, there have been plenty of comments submitted by both industry, my own organization, submitted comments, a consortium of organizations submitted comments for how you can define that, both of those things in a way that actually are not overly burdensome to keep the reporting in place. But we're not the only ones with reporting requirements. The Europeans have the NIS2 directive that's coming into effect that actually requires reporting for critical infrastructure there. The Japanese have reporting requirements. The Indians have reporting requirements. The Australians have reporting requirements. So around the planet, there is a definite move to have reporting from critical infrastructure when it actually experiences a significant cyber incident, to start having those incidents be reported to governments.
So what do you think causes more of the challenge on cybersecurity, guidance or money?
So I was thinking while Rob and Michael and Camille were talking, a couple of us were in the Clinton administration, which I guess is embarrassing. But at that time in the second Clinton administration, NSF.
Yeah, I go back that far too.
Yeah, that's right. So at least two of us. The NSF paid for the internet. And there was a point where it got to about 100 million people where they said, we just can't do this anymore. Remember that guy, what was it, Postel, ran out of his basement?
Yeah.
Yeah. So people said, look, we got to move to some more commercial system. How do we pay for it? And there was a lot of debate. This was Tom Khalil, I think, was head of NEC at that point. How do you pay for the damn thing? And how do you regulate it in a way, if at all, that keeps it on, gets it off the ground? We didn't want to kill it, And the after a lot of back and forth, the way to pay for it was by trade. You give them your data, they give you services. We don't like that trade anymore. The light touch regulation, that was Ira Magaziner. He'd come out of the triumph of telecom deregulation. And they said, well, we'll have things like Section 230. We'll have other stuff. We don't want to regulate. We won't have authentication requirements. So the foundation of this thing, which was so fragile, probably needs to be reexamined. It probably doesn't work anymore, but that might be too hard. Sometimes you inherit something and you're stuck with it. So we might be stuck with it. And then the question is, in that context, how do we pay for it? How do we make it work?
And then I think that's where the liability question comes in, because if companies aren't liable for something that they may have caused harm, they're not necessarily interested in spending any money on it. That money goes to sales or marketing to sell more of something that may or may not be breaking things. So is the question, going back to the earlier CISA question, do we feel like we have the liability lever at the right space right now, or is it kind of questionable as we go to AI, or what is there thoughts on that?
I mean, we didn't have the liability levers right before AI.
Okay.
We certainly don't have it right
Now.
now. So, no. I mean, I think the incentives in industry to build secure software, to rebuild older software, legacy software, so that it is secure with new AI tools that make it possible are not there. The incentive as... Like, were you the one who said it's yes? Okay, so getting first to market is still the imperative, right? The easiest, cheapest way to do that is not to worry about security. Even though AI can make it much easier and much faster to build secure software, the market is not incentivized to do that. We're not at a point with AI where AI is just writing secure software out the back and you don't need to invest any time or any money into the security of your software. That is a possible vision. I don't know if it's a realistic one, but it is a possible outcome. But it is not the outcome that we have now. The models have been trained on all the software that existed from the beginning of the internet until now. Most of that software was not written securely. Therefore, these models out of the box are producing insecure software. And so if you're using those to build software, it's going to be insecure. You need to invest on top of it to build security. We do not have the incentives to do that today.
I would just say, so if you look on the government side, and if you talk about incentives, one of those quirks of the federal budgeting process, you mentioned that, is that in general, for most agencies, it is far easier to get operational dollars out of Congress than it is to get procurement dollars. So where do you maintain old software? Operational dollars. Where do you get new software and new hardware? Procurement dollars. So the incentive for agencies is to keep old hardware and old software as long as they possibly can, because it is really hard to get the money to get new stuff, but it is very easy to get money to keep the old stuff running, even if over the long run, it would be cheaper to get the procurement dollars or to invest the procurement dollars. So you have an incentive structure on the federal agency side that is guaranteed to result in lower security because of the way that we do budgeting for almost every agency across the government.
So I wonder if people could join me in singing Mr. Rogers' theme song, because it was a beautiful day in the neighborhood in 1998. And so having this sort of crummy lash up to produce buggy software and vulnerable networks wasn't a big deal, because it ran along it's been a great success. Think of all the things that have come. That's why we're having this conference. What we didn't expect was that the Chinese would wake up one day. There was a big internal debate in China. Should we go with the rest of the world or should we be more nationalistic? Unfortunately for us, the wrong side won that debate. And so we now face a skillful, highly motivated, hostile opponent who has become a peer, frankly. And the internet wasn't designed to deal with a peer opponent. And so we're kind of stuck. And that's a lot of what is driving this. If it was still the millennial, what was it, the end of history, that it was. See, he laughed.
Poor Professor Fukuyama.
He'll never live that down.
No.
But it was a nice guess at the time. It's not the end of history anymore. History's back with a vengeance. And the internet wasn't designed to withstand it.
Camille, do you have a comment on that?
Security as a mechanism to drive this kind of incentive shift as we shift from internet infrastructure to AI infrastructure. I think we're at a pivot moment where we could make a meaningful change, despite the procurement conundrum, despite all of these things, if we were so motivated. Because we are going to spend procurement dollars to buy the CPU, to buy everything we need to run AI, government, industry, otherwise. I actually think it's a fallacy that industry doesn't want some kind of guidance on where the boundaries should be. Now, they definitely don't want as much as maybe some people feel is necessary or whatever. But I actually think industry would like that kind of guidance and like the US to be on first rather than it shifting to a globally dictated dynamic that is outside of the depth of understanding that happens here. But we're likely to lose that battle. So I think we find ourselves in this moment where it could be ripe for a lot of the shifts, despite some of the boundaries that we face or the hurdles that we face, but we're not going to seize that moment, which is disappointing.
So I'm a really big Silicon Valley, the show. I just love it. I want them to do a reboot so bad. But Rob, you said something that reminded me, this keeps showing up on my Instagram feed, the clip where he explains that the son of Anton didn't do the wrong thing. He just tried to correct all the bugs in the software, which was everything. So it deleted everything. And then it ordered pizza. So you could redesign cybersecurity policy from kind of square one today. If you walked in and had a client that said, I'm willing to just take it all off and start, is that even possible? I mean, could you start from like tabula rasa in today's environment?
I'll take the cheap answer and say no.
You have to start from somewhere.
The installed base is just so great. And think of how long did we wrestle with BGP? Is it fixed?
It's not fixed.
Yeah. And that
We're
was
still on IPv4.
Yeah.
that was around when I came into this stuff like 25 years ago, right? So the pace of change is somewhat disappointing, and we're going to have to deal with an inherited base that's vulnerable. So that points to other kinds of solutions, whether it's agreements with attackers, whether it's better law enforcement. If the Russians and the Chinese backed off the gas pedal, a lot of our problems would be greatly reduced. But to do that, you have to engage with them.
Anyone think we could start it from zero? No.
I think in some ways one possible outcome from some of the AI advances is what's been talked about in the industry is the great cleansing fire, like a forest fire of vulnerabilities, that the AIs will find so many vulnerabilities so fast in all of the old legacy software that it will essentially force companies to like burn down all of the old stuff and essentially replace it, at least maybe not on the hardware side, but at least on the software side. That is not a zero chance probability, by the way. So you could see something like that. But we're not at the point where we're deploying this for the first time. So we're not going to be able to really start at zero. But that doesn't mean that we don't make attempts to improve the incentive structure, to change the liability structure, to change how we talk about guardrails, where we want to put things. Like all of these things are political choices. And I mean that in the traditional small p sense of the way. They're political choices. They're political economic choices, and we could make different ones.
So we're going to go to questions because we have 10 minutes left, but I'm going to lead with a question with a colleague, a friend in the room, Karen. So be prepared. So Karen works for a company called Inner Isle, who did a report that came out this, I think it was December, that says that cyber criminal activity is the 4th largest economy in the world. And as somebody, and I think a lot of us in the room, we all have our own various things. I couldn't get into one of my own credit card accounts. I just had so many accounts yesterday. During the Super Bowl, I'm trying to do all my accounting. Didn't work. The best thing I've done for my mom is I've just basically slowly gotten her off of social media by changing all of her passwords, and she doesn't know it. And she thinks that Apple News is internet, so that's fine. So that's one way to do it. But you have to have somebody who doesn't completely know what the hell's going on for that to work, which might be a bigger pool than I think about. But how do we manage from the consumer side? And Jim will just freak me out and be like, it doesn't matter. The Chinese have all your stuff anyway. Why do you bother? Is usually your answer.
Scott McNeely, 1998.
Karen, did anything you want to add to that?
Thanks for the shout out, Shane. I do have a question for the panel. So one of the things I look at more is cyber crime, particularly frauds and scams. And one of the things that we see when we look at how these mostly commercial criminal actors are operating is they are now much more effective in how they are able to combine resources from the dark web and the commercial economy to build much broader scale and more effective attacks. I noticed that on the panel, you were a lot of times talking about large state actors in terms of China and in terms of Russia. My question is, how are you thinking about the ability for smaller scale actors with AI and other resources to be able to pull together more distributed attacks that are not necessarily centralized from politically motivated state operators?
So I'll take this one to say that, well, if those small operators are in the United States or in Western Europe or any country that still has any semblance of not being a criminal syndicate itself, we can solve that problem. That is the problem that the FBI can solve. The problem that we cannot solve is cybercriminal operators in North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia, because we do not have a cooperative party on the other end, right? So if you can't threaten the physical being of the person who is engaging in the crime, whether they're using AI or not, you're not going to be able to stop this, right? And no, we're not going to be able to get cybercrime up to a point where we can deter Russia or deter China or deter Iran or North Korea, right? It's not an important enough issue on the bilateral agenda, if we even have a bilateral agenda with any of those countries anymore. And so, what this means is that ultimately the burden is going to fall either to the end victim, not an outcome I want. I don't want Michael's mom to have to secure her system against sophisticated operators enabled with AI. It needs to fall on the banks. It needs to fall on the stewards of our data and the stewards of our economy that keep it operating. And so we've just got to place the burden there. And then those companies can find ways to manage the costs of doing business on the internet that we have in the 21st century.
I also think that part of our challenge, you're absolutely right. If I look at like the sharing that goes on inside CTA on a daily basis, the overwhelming majority of the information that's shared is about criminal activity. And in terms of what actually affects citizens, not just in the United States, but around the world on a day-to-day basis, most of it is scams and fraud. That's what actually affects people. And yet, there is also this nation state threat, and they're different, but they're interrelated now because of the issues that Rob was raising. And it gets even more complex because the cyber criminal organizations on the other end have also mutated into highly complex organizations that involve other kinds of crime. So, for example, we're now discovering that a lot of those scams and fraud are coming out of forced, or what I would even call slave labor camps in Southeast Asia. Right, where you have enslaved people that are being forced to commit crimes. And that makes it a lot more complex about how you impose costs on those people, because I'm not really sure that's the right answer either. There are some spaces in here, though, for some increased ability to disrupt those organizations, because what they've done is they've made themselves into businesses. They've made themselves into highly distributed, highly effective businesses with long supply chains, which actually provides an opportunity for us to disrupt those supply chains if we think about how we're willing to do it. I do think that this means that we have to be willing to reach out and touch computers in other countries in a way that we've not been comfortable doing. And unless we're willing to do that, we won't be able to get at this problem.
Yep.
So just a quick footnote, there's something called the UN Cybercrime Convention. And one of the things I and a few other people will be doing in 2026 is pushing to get this adopted. And the U.S. probably won't adopt it, so I know we're going to lose going in. But cybercrime is a big problem until it comes to actually committing to doing something about it. And then it's like, oh, well, it's number 32 on the list. We'll get to it.
You had a follow-up.
Yeah, I just want to say our recent study that Shane was mentioning is actually called the Cybercrime Supply Chain. And one of the things that we see, and I want to comment on something that Rob said, one of the things that we find in our studies is that a lot of these commercial actors, they are actually using a lot of US-based infrastructure to host and acquire the resources that they need for attacks. Now, they're also using infrastructure and resources in other countries. But that, for me, says, look, we don't necessarily have to just rely on dealing with criminal actors in less than cooperative countries, we have levers in terms of the supply chains that they are using to put together these attacks in which to disrupt those supply chains, because a lot of them are using infrastructure in the United States to commit these crimes.
So, yeah, let me jump in on this. I can't agree more. In the first Trump administration, they put together an executive order that used existing authorities to implement a Know Your Customer program like banks have for cloud providers. It was a very good piece of policy. It also had an off-ramp, which was to say, hey, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, whoever, if you can't do Know Your Customer, if you can't identify who the actual end customer is and then block somebody who is sanctioned or a criminal entity, come to us with alternative measures that show your infrastructure isn't being used by these entities, that you have other ways to prevent it, whether it's putting the actors inside a walled garden until they prove that they're capable, being able to rapidly shut off the activity, being able to cooperate with law enforcement. It was a very good policy intervention in this space that the major cloud providers fought tooth and nail against and managed to slow the implementation of in the Biden administration to the point that it was never put into place in the Biden administration, even though the executive order was not rolled back. This Trump administration has not, to my knowledge, moved forward with their original piece of policy. They also have not rolled it back. So I think we have a solution to this problem in existing policy that needs to be implemented. The problem is I had any number of senior executives at very large corporations whose names I will not mention come into my office and say, this is the number one thing that you need to kill. And those same corporations have a lot of clout in this administration. So I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to get implemented now. But it's absolutely an issue, and we have a solution in existing policy that would partially address it.
All right, time for one last question. I'm going to go to this side of the room since I started on their side. Question over here? Anyone? Up front? Did you? Yeah, up right here.
Hi, Derek Johnson with Cyberscoop. One of the things that I am curious about, because we had a discussion about the impact that AI is going to have on our cybersecurity strategy in the health arena. We've seen a lot of apps come in. I know that health data is protected by very specific laws that other folks aren't. I would love to hear kind of how you all see something like that intersecting with security in the health space, because it does seem over the last month or two, we've seen a lot of big companies come out with health apps. A lot of people use them. So would love to hear your thoughts.
Quick answer on health. Is it better off than the others?
Heavily regulated spaces have tended to really lean in on security for AI systems. They're really concerned about running afoul of the requirements that they already have. And so healthcare traditionally has been struggling a little bit. So I'm not sure that means that they'll be out front. But from what I've seen, most of them are leaning in a bit on security. That said, our cybersecurity posture is focused on a lot of the wrong things. We talked a lot about focusing on the perimeter. Now we need to be focused on like delegation of authority and dependency and things like that. That is a modality shift or a mental model shift around governing systems, leveraging security that is a little bit different and may not be at the forefront for them.
Any other comments quickly?
I think this will drive, particularly in the United States, this question of your health data and how it's used. Like, that is very sensitive to a lot of people. What's interesting is that a lot of that is around the issues of your health insurance coverage and whether or not you can be denied benefits and things. And one of the really interesting things is if in other societies where health coverage is not as dependent on the private sector in that way, the concern about health data is actually much lower, because it can't be used to kick you off of benefits and things like that. That's not even possible. So the concerns about health data are actually very culturally and like socially determined depending on the larger environment.
Please join me in thanking my panel. I appreciate it.